everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Josh McKelvin. Senator Jeanne Shaheen was in Belgium the day that one of the world's most wanted terrorists was captured for his role in the attacks in Paris. 2 days later, the deadly subway attacks occurred in Brussels. Fortunately, the senator was out of harm's way, but having been there recently certainly brings a unique perspective. My first guest this morning, and that's where we'll start. Good to see you, ma'am. Yeah, obviously this was a tragic situation, but probably a little bit more jarring for you having just been there.
Well, it was really tragic to land in Paris on our way back from Estonia and to get the news that the attacks had just occurred in Brussels, and we had just left there the day before. So it was just a horrible attack. I mean, it points again to ISIS and the fact that they will do anything, and that they don't care if they attack civilians and who gets hurt. I think it's the ultimate act of cowardice for ISIS, and we've got to do everything we can to fight that, and we've got to work together and cooperate together. And that's what the Brussels Forum was talking about, is how we work together as Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance, North America, the US and Canada, to really fight the terrorists. And for Europe and for Belgium in particular, they have a real threat from homegrown terrorists. They have the highest percentage of people who have gone to fight in Syria and then returned to Belgium. And so they and Europe need to think about how they can better integrate people into their society. And it was one of the topics at the Brussels Forum.
And the sharing of information, obviously very important as well. Let me ask you this. When the terrorist was captured on that Saturday, I think you said it was there, what's it, Salah
Abdeslam.
Right. Was there... Did it heighten security in the city? I mean, there was a recognition that something could happen as a result of that?
You know, we commented as we drove from the airport to our hotel in downtown Brussels about the security that we saw throughout the city. We saw a lot of local police officers on the street. When we went by several European and international organizations, there were military out in front of those offices with what looked like AK-47s over their shoulder, guarding those entrances. As you know, the offices of the EU, the offices of NATO are in Brussels, and so there was a lot of international work going on in that city, and we did see a real heightened military and police presence in the city.
Yeah, and ISIS obviously continues to be a global threat. Let's talk about threat here in New Hampshire. Obviously, that's a heroin crisis. You're well versed in it. You and Senator Kelly Ayotte have been working together in lockstep on this. That must have been satisfying for you, though, last week when the president made some moves there to give a recognition from the federal level of how important this is.
You know, I think we should feel good in New Hampshire because people are working together. The governor and the legislature, the congressional delegation, in our communities. We had a forum last night in the city of Dover with all of the mayors from Stratford County. And it's nice to finally see the attention at the federal level because, you know, this is a pandemic. Yeah. It's affecting, the last year we have statistics for, we lost 47,000 people from the heroin epidemic. And we haven't, until recently, had enough focus at the federal level and provided the kind of resources that communities and states need, because they're the ones on the front lines. Our law enforcement, firefighters, emergency medical personnel who respond to heroin overdoses, our hospitals, the treatment facilities, they need resources, and that's one of the things I've been working on in Washington.
And for all the heat that public officials take, elected officials take for partisan squabbles, on this particular issue, it is nice to see, and a lot of people can point to that, people are working together regardless
Absolutely.
of party.
It's something that we've got to do because, you know, this is not an epidemic that affects young or old. It doesn't affect Republicans or Democrats. It doesn't affect you if you live in Manchester or the Seacoast. It affects people everywhere, and we've got to treat it that way.
And it's not an easy problem to solve, no question about that. But one area where you and Senator Ayotte do part ways, though, is the Supreme Court nominee. You joined with John Broderick earlier this week. Not sure exactly how to phrase this because there are some Democrats out there, Harry Reid, Joe Biden, they've said in the past that it's not as big a deal as they're making it right now. Why is it so important?
Well, I think Vice President Biden's comments when he was the chairman of the Judiciary have been taken out of context. But the point about today's situation is that this would be the first time in history that we would see the majority controlling the Senate block a nominee coming from the president for the Supreme Court. So 14 times in this country's history, in an election year, we've had an opening on the Supreme Court, we've had the president send over to the Senate a nominee, and the Senate has acted on that. Most recently in 1988, when Ronald Reagan was president, his last year in office, he sent to the democratically controlled Senate his nominee, Anthony Kennedy. He got a hearing, he got voted 97-0, passed out of the Senate. And so this is, I think this is a partisan effort to make something that shouldn't be partisan, and that is our Supreme Court and the nominees to the Supreme Court. In the entire history of the United States, every nominee has gotten a hearing on the Senate floor, at least for the last 100 years. And we need to act on this. You know, we all took an oath of office that said we would protect and defend the Constitution. The Constitution says the president shall nominate, the Senate shall advise and consent. We need to act on Merrick Garland. He's a deserving nominee. He needs to get a hearing. We need to just give him an up or down vote. You know, when we took that oath of office, we didn't say we were only going to defend the Constitution when it's not an election year. This
is going to be an issue in this election year. There's no question about that. And moving forward, I think we're going to hear a lot about the Supreme Court nominee or the lack of action by the Senate. Let me ask you, interested in your take. Senator Kelly Ayotte, obviously running against Maggie Hassan, who you're friends with and supporting. She asked Maggie Hassan to sign the People's Pledge, something you asked Scott Brown to do. He declined, but Kelly Ayotte asked Maggie Hassan to sign the People's Pledge. She declined, came back with a counteroffer. Were you disappointed that it didn't come down to some sort of agreement?
You know, Josh, I think we need to reduce the amount of money in politics. I think it's the view from the public is that special interests are driving the political process, and I think they're right in so many cases. And I think one way to address that is to reduce the amount of money that's being spent and to level the playing field for everyone. You know, when I first ran for governor, we had a spending limit in New Hampshire. We said you can only spend a certain amount of money. I think we would all benefit from that. So I would hope that everyone would support legislation that would reduce the amount of money in politics. That's what I've done. I supported legislation that would have addressed the Citizens United decision and said everybody has to identify who they are if they're spending money in a race. I've supported a constitutional amendment that would say we need to address the amount of money spent in politics. So I think we need legislation at the national level to address this, and I think we really need to reduce the amount of money.
Let me ask you about this election cycle, because there seems to be, if there's any loyalty or energy, it's behind something different. As long as it's different, it's better than what's going on right now. First, how glad are you that you're not running in this cycle?
Oh, I'm very relieved that my campaign is over for this term and that I've got another 5 years.
Yeah, but what do you make of what's happening here? I mean, is the political landscape or the philosophy changing fundamentally with the American voter? Do you think we're seeing a real transformation?
Well, certainly we're seeing voters who are very frustrated and angry. And I think one of the things they're angry about is that they feel like so many decisions are being made by special interests and that people don't have a voice in Washington. And they're frustrated around the gridlock that they see. They don't see us working together in Washington to address the issues that they are concerned about, which is one of my concerns about the Supreme Court nomination. I mean, I think we need to work together and we need to do the people's business. We need to do our jobs. And I think that's one of the things that people are very concerned about. Now, I think they're showing that frustration in ways that I think aren't helpful to the outcome, because one of the reasons we've gotten here is because people have gone to Washington who are not willing to work together, to compromise, to get things done. And what we're seeing from some candidates in this presidential race is the same kind of philosophy. Certainly Donald Trump is taking the position that it's my way or the highway. Well, I don't think that gets done what we need to get done in Washington.
Well, natural segue into the comments made by Donald Trump this week. Certainly upset a lot of people, a lot of women. Regarding abortion. I don't need to repeat what he said. It's out there Sunday morning by this time. What's your take on what he said there and what you believe he represents in terms of the political culture right now?
You know, it's very disappointing to me to see what has happened with Donald Trump's campaign, because I think he has taken positions that undermine the values that this country was built on. Obviously, I totally disagree with his comments around women's access to reproductive care. I support a woman's right to choose. I think women should be able to make those decisions, and I think his comments showed a total lack of understanding about the challenges that women and families face. Just to see shown a total lack of understanding about religious freedom that this country was built on, about the importance of immigrants in the history of this country and how they have helped build this country, and the condoning of the use of violence at some of his rallies, where he has seemed to indicate that it's okay to punch people in the face, to take people out. I mean, that is just not okay in American politics. One of the things we need more of is more respect for other people's opinions. We don't have to agree on everything, but we do need to respect each other, and we do need to allow people to express themselves in a way that helps us build a consensus. What we don't need in this country is more division. We need more bringing people together, and I fear that Donald Trump plays to all of those divisive, angry feelings that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he continues to be a story for the things he says, but some of the things he says would have ended other campaigns a long time ago for whatever reason. He stays there. One thing I want to close with, we're almost out of time, the health of the New Hampshire primary. We see where things stand now. Hillary Clinton obviously had a tough time here in New Hampshire, but adjusted her campaign and seems to have righted the ship, while the three remaining Republicans are still, they were 1, 2, and 3 here in New Hampshire. That bodes pretty well for the New Hampshire voter, yes?
I think so, and what's still important about the New Hampshire primary hasn't changed. It's changed, you know, there is more media attention, but voters still want to see the candidates. They still have an opportunity to ask them questions, to hear what their vision is for the future of this country, and that's what's important about the New Hampshire primary. So I don't think that changes.
Now, there's any talk in Washington, the candidates were saying it when they were here, that there are people who would like to take the primary away. Do you think it's healthy? Do you think it needs to be defended? I mean,
I think we need to always defend it and never take anything for granted. We need to make sure that at the conventions that those of us who believe in the New Hampshire primary are there to support it and make sure that there aren't changes made that undermine it.
Okay, very good. Senator, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us.